I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London with me, George Galloway. 1 year ago, murder most foul took place at the Baghdad airport. Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes and General Qasem Soleimani were savagely murdered from the air by the United States of America, which made no attempt to conceal their involvement in the crime, indeed boasted of that crime. But as the French statesman Talleyrand said when told of the murder of a political opponent, his secretary said it's a terrible crime. He said it's worse than a crime, it's a blunder, by which he meant that the stated intentions of the killers would not only not succeed, but would likely backfire, and in the most terrible way. This, I think, is true also of the murder of General Qasem Soleimani and the Iraqi resistance leader Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes. The first consequence, unforeseen or foreseen, is the strengthening of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the terrible curse of the head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating extremists everywhere in the world, including in Western countries. The second consequence, certainly unforeseen, was that the murder drew together the people of Iraq and Iran, drew together the people of Iran, an outpouring of national unity, mourning, yes, but absolutely determined also, making them a more impregnable foe to the United States, the murderers, than they might otherwise have been. They have elevated both of these men into heroic stature in history even more than they already were. Because General Qasem Soleimani, as his daughter memorably said on television, was the slayer of ISIS, was the main sword against the kind of Islamist extremism that has proliferated ever since the US and UK invasion and occupation of Iraq. All of the consequences are not yet out into the open. Iran will surely retaliate again and more severely than it already has for the slaughter of a man of very great importance in the state and a man of very great importance to the people of Iran, indeed to his co-religionists everywhere. Hundreds of millions of people around the world felt the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani most keenly. And though it may seem a quietude exists as the United States goes into a period of transition between the president who murdered the men, President Donald Trump, and the president to come, one assumes, Joe Biden. That quietude will not last forever. I believe that the tectonic plates in the Persian Gulf shifted a little with the murder of these men, and not to the advantage of the murderers. But as always, I'm joined here by an audience of experts. I'm the enthusiastic amateur. We will be discussing the consequences of the assassination 1 year ago. Syed Mohsen Abbas, you are a journalist, an analyst, a documentary filmmaker. Let's go to you first. You must have been as shocked as anyone at the killing of a diplomat with a diplomatic passport on a peace mission in a neighboring country where the United States supposedly has fraternal relations with the government of that country, yet they had no compunction about committing murder on their soil. Tell us how you felt at the time and what you think the consequences are.
I think it was just it was a pivotal moment, because everything that happened before Trump had come into power was pretty much what was happening during Trump's time in terms of US policy in that region. But never had we seen something so blatant, so flagrant, and so much of an own goal, really, from the Americans, because who could defend an extrajudicial killing of this nature? I mean, it was very much on the record that General Soleimani, Major General Soleimani, was on a diplomatic mission invited by the Iraqi establishment, the Prime Minister himself, and he was also under observation from the Saudis, who are the allies of the Americans. So it was all above board. It was known. There was nothing hidden. He was even carrying mobiles, etc. So there was nothing, no subterfuge. Yet the Americans decided on absolutely no pretext to sort of basically assassinate, kill, murder, whatever you want to call it. The consequences everybody knows that could have happened at that time didn't fully materialize because of the Islamic Republic of Iran's restraint. The reality is that with the number of ballistic missiles, with the amount of military, if you like, readiness that the Islamic Republic of Iran has, they could have responded far more, if you like, assertively than they did. In the end, Ain al-Assad was the slap which Ayatollah Khamenei promised, which came pretty immediately. Again, it's been hushed up as to how many American military soldiers were actually genuinely injured, brain injuries and whatnot.
More than 100.
More than, yeah, at least 100. At first, they didn't admit any at all. Now, of course, Ayatollah Khamenei has said, as a result of what the Americans did, there will be further slaps. And the lightest of them will be that the Americans will be, if you like, dislodged or uprooted, or made very uncomfortable in the Middle East or West Asia, however you like to put it. The second slap will be the total, if you like, erasure of American presence in the Middle East. That's the second slap which Ayatollah Khamenei has promised. The third element would, I assume, be the revenge that they talk about, because they've targeted 36 individuals who have an arrest warrant out. Donald Trump is among them. And the Iranians have promised that they will exact revenge at a time and place of their choosing, when they feel it is right. So already that revenge, if you like, is on the table. As to when they do it, how they do it, that remains to be seen. If Iran had responded with even more, if you like, vicious ballistic missiles attacks, they could have reached Tel Aviv. They could have reached any of the allies of the Americans in the Middle East there. It would have been a potential world war. That's what Donald Trump was playing with when he did this absolutely outrageous and stupid move, quite frankly. Now it's not improved. The situation has been compounded by the murder of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the nuclear scientist. Again, the same thing, only this time on Iranian soil. And for that, again, the IRGC has promised a response, and that response is now guaranteed. And it's the Americans who are pushing constantly for war, along with the Israelis egging them on, and actually now alleged to be directly participating in it with the murder of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh.
The situation, though, must be difficult for the Iranian government. You can keep on saying there will be a reaction, there will be an answer, there will be revenge. Meanwhile, more and more people keep getting murdered. To what extent do you think these events, let's conflate them for a moment, sure, the Fakhrizadeh assassination, the assassination of General Soleimani, To what extent will that bring about political changes inside the Islamic Republic itself?
Well, the changes have already begun. First of all, in 2021, the elections are due again in Iran, just as in the American situation, we've got it now. The Iranian establishment will change, and it's pretty much guaranteed that the hardline conservatives will come back into power in Iran. Now, that has major implications because so far, the JCPOA, the negotiating element, the reformist element within Iran, the ones who want to sit down around the table with the Americans and make some kind of deal, actually, deep down, those guys like Rouhani and Jawad Zarif, who've been the incumbent powers within government, they'll be out. And if they go out and the return of the conservatives happens, then we've got a situation where there is no difference between the government and, if you like, the people in the background, whether it's the IRGC or whether it's the office of the Ayatollah Khamenei. There are lots of these other conservative forces that have been, if you like, balanced off, if you like. That will no longer be the case. And what will happen is that response is far more likely to be far harsher if the Americans continue down this road of aggravating, provoking, and trying to, if you like, get a response from the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is what Israel wants, by the way, and it is the reason why the Islamic Republic hasn't responded fully, because they know right now that Benjamin Netanyahu wants a war, but he doesn't want to be the one on the front line. He'd rather have the Saudis and the UAE and the Americans fight his war for him. And the Iranians are not falling for it. They have a policy of death by 1,000 cuts in the Middle East, both for Israel and for America, I believe, and I think that's what they're pursuing at the moment. They're not going to be drawn into a battle which is initiated by them at a time when Israel requires that war.
Ahmed Caballo, investigative journalist and broadcaster. Give us your overview, first of all, on the crime and the consequences.
The crime itself, the reaction to the crime was quite alarming because I think Democratic Senator Chris Murphy said it's the equivalent of assassinating the Secretary of State in the United States. Yet, any attack on a foreign nation, extrajudicial killing, is only permitted by a US president if it's seen to be an imminent threat. Now, it's never been shown to us what imminent threat Suleymanni and Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis presented to the US, and there was a letter presented to the Congress, but that has been classified. We don't know what it is. The American public have not been made aware. The wider public have not been made aware. Yet, the allies of the United States have not acted harshly or sanctioned them for this action. It is essentially shown the US...
It's already forgotten in the West. We need to make that clear.
Yeah, it's already forgotten in the West. The same with the assassination of a scientist recently. And again, I ask myself, a scientist has been assassinated, a scientist that was developing a COVID vaccine. Where's the outrage amongst the scientific community? Where's the outrage amongst the professional class? Because this isn't a politician. The mainstream media have tried to paint him as the scientist of doom and developing these nuclear weapons without a shred of evidence. And I think the reaction to both deaths shows that it's one rule for some and another rule for others. And I think the biggest problem now is Iran is seen to be part of the resistance axis. And the population in Iran want their country to resist. And at the moment, we're getting words saying that there will be retaliation, there will be further slaps. But it seems at the moment that Iranian officials and Iranian scientists are free targets, because at the moment there hasn't been any significant consequences to those that have acted aggressively against the Islamic Republic.
Jerry Downing, you're a man of the left, a socialist. Why do you think these double standards, that scientists can be killed, generals can be killed, diplomats can be killed, and not only is there no outrage in the West, it's very promptly forgotten about? Why?
Because the United States remains the global imperialist hegemonic power. It rules it over every other imperialist nation. For instance, it sanctioned Iran, and not alone did it sanction Iran, but it sanctioned the countries that refused to sanction Iran. It was able to do that because it has the It has the economic power, it has the power of the dollar, and it has the power of the US financial institutes and banks that are able to fine countries who refuse to carry out the instructions of the United States, although there might be nothing at all in their own constitutions or in their own laws that says that they've done anything illegal. So there was, for instance, when the Gulf War started, a journalist asked George Bush, isn't what you're doing illegal? It has no sanctions for the United States. And he said, oh, illegal, is it? I must consult my lawyer. Well, that was his cynical response, because the US doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It doesn't recognize any international law against itself. It does demand that international law be imposed on other people, but not against itself or not against its own citizens. And it does not, and for instance, it affords the same privileges to Israel. Israel is likewise immune from international law, although there's various attempts. Israel assassinated 4 scientists in Iran between 2010 and 2014. It regularly assassinates opponents, including the infamous case where they had forged British and Irish passports in order to carry out these assassinations.
This was in Dubai, yes,
yeah.
which now has normal relations with Israel that did that. Well, let's hear from David Otto. He was the director of counter-terrorism here in London. He is a certified master anti-terrorism specialist. And see if he thinks this was terrorism or anti-terrorism. David.
Thank you.
David, is this not state terrorism by definition?
I think, George, what we've seen, especially in the case of which you've rightly mentioned, this is more of state aggression, against another state. Now, the reason why I say that is because most governments, like the United States, for example, have used the label of terrorism to carry out, assassinations against individuals that they label as terrorists. Now, whether these individuals are actual terrorists or not, the justification is seen by the brutality of the kind of, attacks that are being carried out, using drones, what I call a closer weapon and a faraway killer. So you can define this exactly as you said, as a state sponsored terrorism. But the event of 9/11 and the issue of labeling individuals as terrorists and saying that they are being killed because they pose an imminent threat to one country or another. It's a normal tactics that the most powerful nations use as part of their geopolitics. This is not strange, and this is happening all the time. And we see that in the case that you've just mentioned.
Well, I mean, based on that definition, Iran would be perfectly entitled to assassinate an American general in Bahrain or anywhere.
Of course, you're very correct that as a sovereign state, Iran can carry out the same kind of preemptive strike against a U.S. general, and it would give the same excuse and say they did this on the basis of preventing an imminent threat against the Iranian government. I mean, we saw the reaction of Iran when this attack happened. Now, the channels of strategic communication that went behind closed doors, whether there was any form of de-escalation of the situation, nobody really knows. But I can tell you that Iran, had all the rights, to retaliate.
The UN Special Rapporteur has already declared this killing to have been unlawful. Unlawful means, therefore, that these assassinations were murder, doesn't it?
Yes, of course. These assassinations are unlawful because they're against international politics or international law. They're a breach of a state's sovereignty. I mean, there are several mechanisms that you can use to indict somebody you suspect of being a terrorist, especially somebody who works and is affiliated directly to a state. So there is no doubt that these assassinations are unlawful. Now, the issue is, what is the accountability level here? Can the UN hold the United States to account? And this is where alliances come in. What I always say to people is the United Nations is only as good as its member states. So, even though the UN will condemn it and say it is unlawful against international law, it still doesn't mean anything to the United States because they are the power brokers. So it's a matter of power politics. To be honest.
Why were Western countries virtually silent on such criminal action?
I think, as I mentioned to you earlier on, geopolitics is about coalitions. If the Western countries have a coalition against Iran or against any other state, they would back the preemptive strike, which is carried out by the United States. Even they may stay quiet, they may not say anything. That itself is a sign that they by staying silent, they agree with what the United States is doing. Now, this is how geopolitics works, and unfortunately, it's a situation where the bigger fishes swallow the small ones. So this is not strange, George, to see this happening.
How will incoming President Biden deal with the consequences of these assassinations?
I think the United States always has its domestic policy that may have the Democrats may not like the Republicans' domestic policies, but when it comes to their foreign policies, there is very little difference exerted on the foreign policy angle. I don't think we would see any major shift on the basis of relations between friends and foes. Biden may have won the seat against Donald Trump, who is a Republican, but these are two parties that speak the same language when they step out of their soil. So I really don't see a policy shift as much as one would think. It may be a change of administration, but these policies might likely remain unchanged.
So that's it then, the law of the jungle. Much more coming up after this. You're watching كلمة with me, George غالاوي, on Mayadeen television on the anniversary of the murder by the United States of General Qasem Suleymanee and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes outside Baghdad airport. Jerry, he was remarkably candid for a former senior police officer here in Scotland Yard, but he was telling the truth, I think. All this talk of rules-based order and international law and so on, it's all just lipstick on a pig. And the pig is the law of the jungle, no?
Of course it is. Although the United States has declined in relative terms, there is no real rival that is going to replace them. Of course, China is rising. But Iran, in its situation, you see, it is caught in a bind. the sanctions are really hurting it. Of course, it had the option to close the Strait to Hormuz. You know, my view is that Iran really didn't react very furiously because it would do more damage economically to them than it would to the United States. And they didn't react this time to the assassination of the scientist because they're thinking, well, Joe Biden is coming in and he might be a bit better than Donald Trump, and, you know.
Well, let's hear from an Iraqi. Sami Ramadani is a London-based academic, but from Iraq, and he has long campaigned against both the government of Saddam Hussein and the war and occupation which overthrew him. Sami.
You're most welcome. Okay.
Is this not by definition state-sponsored terrorism?
Of course. I mean, this is, and first of all, it's completely illegal under international law. And they have deliberately targeted two government officials because both General Sulaimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis are government officials, one for Iran and one for Iraq. And General Sulaimani was actually invited by the Iraqi government. So he was on an official visit and he was received by Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis at the airport with his colleagues. And he was due to meet Iraq's officials, I think including Iraq's prime minister, within few hours of his arrival. So he was targeted, both of them, and their people who were with them in the same team. They were targeted and killed. And this is, by any definition of terrorism, is a terrorist act. Some people try to limit the definition of terrorism to only non-state actors, while really the essence of terrorism is to target people outside of any legitimate war theaters or Geneva Convention rules or international law. Anything outside these, targeting people like this is an act of terrorism, of course.
Why has the US been so cavalier about Iraqi sovereignty? After all, that was the reason they gave for invading and occupying Iraq, to return sovereignty to the Iraqi people.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if one considers the incident from the point of view of Iraq's sovereignty, it shows the complete disregard that the United States has for the Iraqi people and their sovereignty, and the sovereignty of Iraq as a state. In fact, the act of its occupation was to destroy Iraq's sovereignty. And Iraq, until today, lacks full sovereignty, lacks full independence because of the presence of US forces, US undue influence through their US embassy, still the largest in the world, is in Baghdad. And their interference in Iraq is really outrageous, whereby they trample upon all diplomatic norms, political norms, and they pay no regard whatsoever to Iraqi sovereignty. I'll give you one good example. Iraqi parliament, at the request of the Iraqi government, passed a law, a resolution in parliament saying that the US-led coalition forces in Iraq, US-led forces, must leave Iraq. And until today, the United States says, no, we don't take that into account at all. So what sort of respect for sovereignty? And this assassination, this great crime, was done precisely because the United States has no respect for Iraq's sovereignty. In fact, it has no respect for any sovereignty across the world because they often violate people's and states' sovereignty.
Why are Western countries so silent about what is so obviously an act of state terrorism?
Yes, because they have a hand in destroying Iraq's sovereignty. And they have a hand in encouraging Israeli acts of aggression in the region. They have a hand in all these. And in fact, the Iraqi parliament's resolution and former Iraqi government's request for the US forces to leave Iraq wasn't only about US forces, but US-led forces. And they include forces from Britain, Australia, other countries. And the resolution that was passed was for all these foreign forces to leave Iraq. But the United States and its allies, especially Britain, are too closely tied together. The British government follows US policy to the line, to the dot, especially regarding the Middle East. And Britain has been known to do that constantly, including, of course, the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003.
How should the Biden administration deal with the consequences of this assassination?
Well, the first thing he should do really is withdraw his forces. Withdraw US forces completely from Iraq, because their presence is linked to their point of entry, which was the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And the forces they have today in Iraq are what is left of their occupation forces in 2003. So step number one is to remove their forces. Step number two, lift the sanctions on various peoples, personalities, states, including, of course, Iran, which is during the coronavirus pandemic is really an international crime to impose sanctions on peoples and states, because these sanctions are affecting ordinary people in their tens of millions. And during a pandemic like coronavirus and COVID-19, it is a major humanitarian crime, a war crime, in fact, to impose sanctions on people. So these are the two most important steps. Step number three is to ask its military base called Israel to stop committing aggression in the region. If he does these three things, then the region could start experiencing a bit of peace, a bit of tranquility for development, for economic progress, for political progress. Peoples of the region can solve their problems together. But the presence of the United States in this nasty sense, military, diplomatic, economic, and support for Israel and support for Saudi war on the people of Yemen, millions of Yemeni people backed by the United States and with the Saudi-led war on them, are suffering enormous hardship today in Yemen. So these are elements that could, if the United States is serious about peace in the region, these are the steps that they should be taking urgently.
Ahmed, the bottom line is the United States did this because they can.
Yes.
And the rest of the world cannot make them pay a price, at least not yet. That's the size of it, isn't it?
It is, but the United States also pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement because they could. But the difference is the Western liberal allies spoke up in defense of the agreement. They did not speak up in defense of Iraq's sovereignty. They did not speak up in defense of Iranian sovereignty. Now, the crime was committed outside of a civilian airport. I've been to Baghdad airport. What about the passengers that were getting on their trip? What about the fact that this crime was done in the capital of a country that the United States claims to have liberated? What about the parliament voting overwhelmingly to remove forces? The whole reason why the United States went to Iraq was to bring democracy. and then when democracy is in action, they choose to ignore that.
Said Mohsen, That's true, isn't it? What we have here is a kind of stasis. Iran can't really get back at the United States, but the murder and the reaction to it has made it plain to the United States that neither can they destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Literally speaking, yes. And what we can't forget is that the more the Americans push the Islamic Republic of Iran into a corner with the sanctions, with the wars, with the threats, all it's done is made the Iranians pick policies which have made them self-sustaining. And the thing that everybody has to recognize is that Major General Soleimani, being who he was, the head of the resistance, the key strategist of the resistance against, if you like, Takfiri terrorism in that region. And who are the Takfiri terrorists? Let's look at it very carefully. In Syria, it's on record that I think Russell was his name, Jacob Russell, I believe, in a WikiLeaks, Julian Assange's WikiLeaks, said clearly to Hillary Clinton, Al-Qaeda is on our side. That's literally the words that he used in that statement in 2012, February 2012, affirming that America was doing business with Al-Qaeda in Syria. That spread across Iraq. All I can see is that our own establishments are voting for our insecurity, for more terrorism of that Takfiri kind coming onto our shores, more Takfirism and terrorism spreading across West Asia, more refugees and migrant crisis as a result of the displacement due to the wars. America, by Trump's own admission, has spent over $7 trillion on war in the West, in West Asia. What he said, we've achieved nothing for it. Yet when he's come in power, he's done nothing really to stop or avert that policy because it's not in his control, I believe. It's part of an out-of-control industrial military complex which just makes money.
But it was his decision to murder these two men.
Well, and for that decision, he's on effectively a warrant for arrest and could be worse. So he will, I think, eventually, be brought to account if the Iranians get their own way. I don't think the Islamic Republic of Iran is really scared of a confrontation.
Jerry, imagine the good luck of the then British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, to be trapped in a lift with me, as he was. And I said to him then that the knives you are giving to the Takfiri fanatics in Syria will one day be in this building, looking for you and looking for me. But how do you explain, I can't, why the public in Britain and the United States appears so unconcerned that Al-Qaeda is on our side, as you said, quoting WikiLeaks, that our policy is so self-evidently not only not moral, but actually very stupid. How do we explain that?
Well, the reason is historical, of course. Traditionally, Labour leaders have sought to privilege their own working class by the booty of empire. That's how they've done it. Of course, Jeremy Corbyn was a shift away from that, but now we've shifted back to that. My view is that the world won't fundamentally change from that capitulation to the power of imperialism until the dollar collapses as the world's trading and reserve currency. The dollar as the world trading and reserve currency enables the United States to effectively force the rest of the world to bolster its own economy. It robs the rest of the world through that. So there's been various attempts to undermine the dollar, and in Libya, that was one of them, in Iraq, etc. But that is the one thing that U.S. imperialism and Democrats and Republicans must prevent. They've got to keep control of the world economy via the dollar and via the World Bank. That's why, in our view, neither China nor Russia should be called imperialist in the classic Marxist sense.
But Ahmed, you do, I used to say, don't imagine that we're ruled by James Bonds. They're more Austin Powers. Donald Trump was about as close to being an Austin Powers, almost literally, as it's possible to imagine. See, that's my point. It's not that these crimes are crimes, it's that they are blunders. They are actually going to achieve the precise opposite of what they're intended to achieve. Explain how we got to the stage where Austin Powers was running our foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I want to answer the question that you asked to my colleague, because the information is there. You can find out how we're colluding with these terrorists, sure, but you have to go look for it. We just saw the trial of Salman Abedi's brother, and
this is the mass murderer of children at the Manchester Arena.
Yeah. That's right. And they went through every single detail, where he lived, the sports that he played. Yet in this trial and day-to-day coverage, they never once exposed the links of how MI5 supported the groups associated to his family to go and fight in Libya. Gave them...
was the Libyan Islamic fighting group. The clue was in the name.
Yeah. Yes. And so if you're a British citizen and you're distracted by the Keeping Up with the Kardashians and all these all these different shows that are on TV, you're not watching the news, you have to go and find the information. The information's not there. When you watch BBC News, when you watch Channel 4 News, when you watch ITV News, and you think they're going to tell you, they don't tell you. They omit the most important part of the story. And I think until we see alternative media, independent journalists, empowered, where they have the same influence as the mainstream, then the everyday British citizen is simply not going to know. I don't think if you was to explain to Pat on the street that the people that are putting our lives in danger at home, our government is supporting and funding them abroad, she'd be outraged. But who tells Pat on the street? Who has Pat's ear on the street? Unfortunately, it's not us at the moment, and that's something that we need to work towards.
Good point, and I accept it entirely. But I was one of the leaders of an anti-war movement in the run-up to the Iraq war that put millions of people regularly on the street against the upcoming war on Iraq. There was nothing. There's no response to the killing of General Soleimani. No response to the killing of the scientist Fakhrizadeh. So it seems like we've gone backwards.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. If you look at the war on Libya, there was hardly any mobilization on the street. So what's happened from 2003 to 2011, in which people who were so outraged at the actions of their governments abroad seem to be desensitized? I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the fact that they don't feel there's any real change, and when there is a potential of change, such as Jeremy Corbyn, then you see all elements of the media demonise him for the bike that he rides, to the graves that he's visited, and again people become desensitised, demoralised, and now we're seeing people leaving the Labour Party in their droves because they don't believe in the system and the people that represent them.
Saad Mohsen, it's a kind of infantilization process, isn't it? We had in 2002, 2003, I used to speak at 3 meetings every day in different parts of the country. We moved millions, but the same people are now operating the same foreign policy almost without challenge here in Britain, and it's true also in the United States.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the infrastructure or the machine that lies behind most of what runs our society doesn't change. The civil servants, the people, the mindset, the education system. If in your education system you're not training kids about politics, philosophy, spirituality, or you're not even giving them any idea about critical reasoning skills, and this is the important thing, what we've produced is people who are consumer producers. We haven't produced thinkers. We're not encouraged to think, not encouraged to criticize. We're not encouraged to ask the question. And this is the issue. Most people don't even have this question in their mind, the kind of questions that we're asking in this program, or you're asking. So therefore, they're not equipped. They don't have the skill sets and the tools, the basic reasoning, critical reasoning, critical thinking, critical questioning skills. This is not to be underestimated. And the schools and the education system and the universities, I'm afraid, are pretty complicit in this, and it runs right through the system.
Last question then, and very briefly, please. Said Mohsen, the killing of these two martyrs 1 year ago, the killing of another in the form of Fakhrizadeh and others just much more recently. That's not the end, is it? If Israel is trying to provoke Iran and the United States into war, they're not going to stop there, are they?
No, this was going to continue, and it's going to be a battle to the death. I have to put it on record. Ayatollah Khamenei says Israel has 25 years left. That is a clear gauntlet, and Benjamin Netanyahu is in the same position. The Israelis are in that same position of saying, look, this is going to go to the wire, it's going to go to the end. Now, ultimately, you have to ask the question, which of these forces has a moral backbone of some kind that you could put your weight behind? Fakhrizadeh was not a villainous man. He had no track record. He was a professional. Süleymanî was a servant of the state, serving the interests of his state. And they were spiritual men. They were God-fearing men. They felt they had a cause for the oppressed. They were helping the people who were oppressed in that region. That's what they would argue, and I would tend to agree with that assessment. The Israelis, I'm afraid, on their fundamental points of justice, can't even give justice to the Palestinians who they've uprooted from their land. They have a settler colonialist mindset, which which is based on paranoia now. It's got a paranoia of their own imminent destruction. They are the most dangerous, if you like, chess piece on the board, because they will go all the way as well. And I think that unless the Americans stop that $3.8 billion a year that they give to Israel to service its existence, we're going to be really empowering, I think, a state which is capable of drawing in the whole world into a mess and a war which none of us will have control over eventually.
Jerry, what's happening next? What's next in that region?
Well, what's next in the region, I think, doesn't, make that much difference to the global picture. I do think there is obviously a big danger that Trump will do some outrage before he goes, in order to prevent Biden making a deal with the states in that region. There is a big danger there, but Trump, his passing, his legacy won't pass that easily, and the difficulty for the Middle East is that Biden actually has a history of more wars than Trump.
Than Trump did. That's a fact, isn't it?
That is the difficulty, and the difficulty that's lodged in that is of course Trump is pitching to his fascistic followers, and pitching towards his fascistic followers. Well, that's exactly what Hitler did. He pitched towards his fascistic followers until he won the domestic thing, and then he made the wars. Trump was not a peacekeeper or anything like it, but he prioritized crushing, and I think that the attempts to impose fascism in the United States will force the U.S. working class to fight. I think, you can have the lowest strike records, and you could have all that since records began in the 1880s, but it's never been the case that the working class has not revived. It will revive, of course, and it will fight, and there's great hopes for people like the Black Lives Matters and those whole move. We know it will revive.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? The country that commits these crimes that projects its power all over the world is now presiding over the biggest unemployment in their country since 1935, the middle of the Depression, cannot even give $600 relief to its own people in the middle of a pandemic that has seen scores actually, of millions of people become unemployed and millions now facing eviction. How do you square that apparent contradiction?
I don't think you can square that apparent contradiction, and I think with the Iraq war, at the same time there was Katrina, and people were asking at the time, how can we be spending billions and trillions of dollars to fight in Iraq, to fight in Afghanistan? Meanwhile, there's people lying on a bed afloat in the middle of some floods and they can't get government assistance. And I think this brings into being the contradiction within the American system. It claims to be the greatest democracy in the world. It claims to be the land of the free. Yet the people there are now rioting. They're now civil unrest, and now there's a health pandemic. They've got the worst numbers of any country in the world. The government's had an atrocious response to it, and yet they seem to be saber rattling against more aggression in the Middle East. There has to be, I agree with my colleague here, there has to be a moment where there's a realization amongst the working class that this country is not working within our interest, and we need to fight for a country that does work within our interest and puts, like Trump said but failed to deliver on, America first.
Putting America first would be fine if it meant that they would let the rest of the world actually attend to their own business without interference, without violence, and without the kind of murder that we commemorate in this program this evening. Thank you for watching.